A retired gunfighter spent 6 years building a quiet ranch life with his son, trying to bury a past soaked in justified blood. Then 3 strangers rode into town working for a land baron who was stealing territory through violence and fraud. In front of witnesses, they humiliated his 12-year-old boy, threw his dead wife's gift into a horse trough, and issued a challenge they thought would go unanswered. But the telegraph operator who'd watched the whole thing knew something those strangers didn't. Men like Jack Cole don't retire, just wait. He sent a message before the boy even got home. Your son was touched. What happened at noon the next day taught an entire territory why certain lines should never be crossed, no matter how much money or firepower backs you up. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? The dust devil spun between the false front buildings of the nameless border town, lazy spirals of ochre and heat that moved like ghosts across the rutted main street. It was the kind of afternoon when sensible people stayed inside where the adobe walls held some memory of morning coolness, when even the dogs sprawled in whatever shade they could find and conserved their energy for evening. The sun hammered down from a sky bleached almost white, and the only sound was the creak of a dry sign swinging on rusted chains outside the general store. That's when the boy appeared in the middle of the street, maybe 12 years old, standing alone with his feet planted wide and his hands clutching a worn cavalry hat like it was the only thing anchoring him to the earth. The hat was too large for him, dark with sweat stains around the band, and there was a bullet hole punched clean through the upper left brim. Old damage. The edges of the torn felt long since dried and faded. The 3 riders came from the south end of town, walking their horses slow and deliberate, the kind of men who moved through frontier settlements like they owned not just the land but the very air above it. Professional guns, all of them, wearing their weapons with the casual certainty of men who'd used them enough times that drawing had become reflex rather than decision. The leader sat at bay, gelding with his hat tipped back and his gloved hands loose on the reins, scanning the empty street with eyes that missed nothing. They circled the boy like wolves assessing prey, hooves clopping softly in the dust, leather creaking as the men shifted their weight in their saddles. None of the townspeople watching from darkened doorways moved to intervene. An old woman pressed her palm against a window glass, but made no motion toward the door. The shopkeeper across the street reached up slowly and pulled his shade down with a rattle that sounded like bones settling. The leader, a man called Vance Hollister, though the boy didn't know that yet, leaned down from his saddle with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever and reached out with one gloved hand. The boy saw it coming but didn't move, didn't duck, just stood there as Hollister's fingers closed on the cavalry hat and jerked it from his head in one smooth motion. Hollister held the hat high, examining it while his 2 companions laughed. He turned it slowly, noting the bullet damage, the sweat-darkened band, the careful stitching where someone had repaired a torn seam. Then he flipped it over, and his smile faltered for just a heartbeat. Something flickered across his face like a cloud passing over sun, as he saw the initials burned into the inside crown with what looked like a branding wire heated in a campfire. JC, 2 letters, simple and permanent. Whose hat is this, boy? Hollister's voice carried that particular edge of cruelty that comes from men who enjoy watching others squirm. The boy looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than 12, harder than any child's eyes should be. When he spoke, his voice didn't shake. My father's. The brief flicker of concern vanished from Hollister's expression, replaced by a laugh that started deep in his chest and rolled out across the empty street. His men joined in, the 3 of them filling the silence with amusement at the boy's expense. Hollister held the hat out over the horse trough that sat outside the general store, making a show of dangling it, and when the boy took an involuntary step forward, Hollister released his grip. The hat hit the water with a splash that seemed obscenely loud in the afternoon quiet. The boy lunged for it immediately, his hands reaching into the trough, but Hollister's boot caught him square in the chest and sent him sprawling backward into the dust. The impact drove the air from the boy's lungs in a sound somewhere between a grunt and a gasp, but he didn't cry out. He didn't beg. The 3 men wheeled their horses toward the saloon at the north end of the street, Hollister calling back over his shoulder in a voice pitched to carry. If your father wants it back, he knows where to find us, boy. You tell him that." The boy pulled himself upright slowly, favoring his ribs where the boot had connected, and reached into the trough with both hands. The cavalry hat came up dripping, water streaming from the brim and the bullet hole, darkening the dust where the drops fell. He held it against his chest despite the wet seeping through his shirt, held it like something sacred that had been violated but was no less precious for the damage. The old woman in the doorway crossed herself with trembling fingers. The shopkeeper, watching through a crack in his pulled shade, shook his head slowly and backed away from the window. In the telegraph office at the east end of town, an operator who'd seen 30 years of frontier violence sat at his key and composed a message of 8 words to an address 15 miles north. But the real question hung in the air like the dust the horses had kicked up, settling slowly over everything. Who was this father? And why did 2 burned initials, JC, make a man like Vance Hollister's smile falter, even for just a second, before his cruelty reasserted itself? This story belongs to the kind of men the Old West produced and then tried to forget. Men who became necessary when civilization was still a promise rather than a fact, who turned dangerous when their skills outlasted their welcome, and who became simply quiet if they were lucky enough to survive their own legends. Jack Cole had been all 3. He'd arrived in Salvation Creek 6 years before that dusty afternoon, driving a wagon that carried everything he and his 8-year-old son owned in the world. He'd paid cash for a small ranch 15 miles north of town, in country where the grass grew sparse but honest and the water ran cold from springs that never went dry, even in August. For 6 years he'd raised cattle, mended fences, talked weather with his neighbors, and given the town no cause for concern. He was a widower who kept to himself, a father who raised his son to be respectful and capable, a man who seemed content to fade into the kind of peaceful obscurity that frontier towns offered to people with hard pasts and no desire to relive them. But before Salvation Creek, before the quiet and the fence mending and the careful anonymity, Jack Cole had been other things in other places. He'd ridden as a cavalry scout during the Apache campaigns when the frontier was still being written in blood across New Mexico and Arizona territories. He'd tracked war parties through country where water was measured in sips and survival meant reading sign that most men would miss entirely. The cavalry officers who'd commanded him wrote in their reports that Cole possessed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate movement, to understand terrain and tactics with an instinct that couldn't be taught. After the Apache Wars wound down into the grim business of reservation enforcement, Jack had worn a deputy marshal's badge in Kansas during the Cattletown years. He'd stood between Texas drovers drunk on whiskey and freedom, and Kansas farmers who'd seen their crops trampled one too many times and were ready to answer hooves with gunfire. The Cattletown Wars had been ugly, personal, soaked in alcohol, and old grievances, and Jack Cole had walked that line with the kind of cold fairness that earned him respect from both sides and friendship from neither. Then had come the railroad years, when the iron tracks pushed west and land became worth killing for. The railroad companies hired men like Jack to protect their interests, which was polite language for putting down claim jumpers and rustlers and corrupt local sheriffs who thought they could extort right-of-way payments. Jack had done that work with the same cold precision he'd brought to every other job. 16 men died by his hand in documented shootings over those 3 years, all ruled justified, all at close range, all ending with that same cavalry colt he'd carried since his scouting days. The territorial newspapers called him efficient. The men who'd ridden with him used a different word, certain. When Jack Cole went to settle a problem, the problem got settled. He didn't grandstand or waste time with warnings. He simply arrived, assessed the situation, and resolved it with whatever level of force the circumstances required. Sometimes that meant talking. Sometimes it meant a threat delivered with enough conviction that smart men believed it. And sometimes it meant the cavalry colt and a burial that happened before sundown. 6 years ago, cholera had swept through a Kansas fever ward and taken his wife in 3 days of horror that left Jack standing beside a pine box with an 8-year-old boy holding his hand and asking when Mama was coming home. That was when something in Jack Cole had broken or maybe finally healed. He'd walked away from all of it, turned in his credentials, sold off his guns except for the cavalry colt he couldn't bring himself to part with, and disappeared into ranch life like a man trying to bury a ghost he couldn't outrun. The boy, Samuel, had been young enough to need a father's hand in shaping what kind of man he'd become. Jack raised him with 2 iron rules that he repeated until they became part of the boy's bones. Never tell a lie, and never run from what's right. Everything else, Jack figured, was negotiable. But those 2 things were the foundation of character, and without them a man was just meat and impulse dressed in clothes. Salvation Creek had accepted them both, grateful for 6 years of peace. The town had seen enough violence in its early years, Apache raids, claim disputes, the usual frontier chaos, and by the time Jack arrived, most people were ready for quiet. They didn't ask too many questions about his past. They noticed the way he carried himself, the careful economy of his movements, the eyes that seemed to catalog exits and cover without conscious thought. But frontier towns were full of men with stories they didn't tell. As long as Jack paid his bills and kept his hands to himself, his history was his own business. But peace is only the space between conflicts. And on a morning when Vance Hollister rode into Salvation Creek bragging about a new boss named Cyrus Trent, who'd bought up half the territory and was consolidating power through legal manipulation and strategic fear, that space collapsed like a bridge cut loose from its moorings. The old telegraph operator, a man who'd been sending and receiving messages since before the Apache Wars ended, saw the collision coming like 2 locomotives running the same track toward each other. He didn't wait for instructions. When he saw that cavalry hat go into the horse trough and the boy take that boot to the chest, he sat down at his key and tapped out 8 words to an address he'd never been given but had memorized anyway, the way you memorize prayers or warnings, boy unharmed. Hat taken. 3 men. Saloon. He sent it because a father deserved to know his son had been touched. He sent it because some violations demanded response regardless of consequences. And he sent it knowing that those 8 words would set something in motion that couldn't be called back, like pulling a trigger or speaking a truth that shatters careful lies. The question that burned through Salvation Creek like wildfire in dry grass. Would Jack Cole ride back as the quiet rancher who'd spent 6 years mending fences and talking weather? Or would he come as the other man, the one who'd measured problems in bullet counts and solved them with terminal certainty? By evening, Hollister and his men had claimed the saloon as conquered territory. They drank on credit they had no intention of paying, their voices loud with the particular arrogance of men who'd worked this program before and knew how it ended. The boss they represented, Cyrus Trent, had spent the last year buying up mineral rights and water claims and county officials with equal efficiency, building an empire through paperwork and intimidation. When people didn't want to sell, Hollister's crew arrived to explain their options in language even stubborn ranchers could understand. Hollister's role was simple: create fear, make examples, negotiate departure dates with the kind of persuasion that left men choosing between their property and their lives. He'd already worked 4 other towns along the territory, leaving each one quieter and more compliant than he'd found it. Salvation Creek was supposed to be just another week's work, another name on the list of places pacified and prepared for Trent's development operations. But there was something gnawing at Hollister beneath his performance of confidence. Those initials burned into that hat had triggered something, a memory, a warning heard secondhand, a name that carried weight he couldn't quite place. He kept asking questions, casual at first, buying drinks for locals, and steering conversation toward Jack Cole. Where exactly was his ranch? How often did he come to town? Did he still carry a gun? What did people know about his past? The questions were too specific, too careful. The locals noticed. This wasn't random curiosity. This was a man measuring an opponent he couldn't quite see, trying to gauge the shape of a threat that existed only in reputation and fading memory. Around sunset, while Hollister was 3 whiskeys deep and telling his men about the beating they'd give Cole when he showed up begging for his hat back, the saloon door opened. Samuel walked in wearing the cavalry hat, dried now, but still too large for his head, sitting on his ears like a crown he hadn't grown into yet. He walked straight through the cigarette smoke and gambling tables to stand in front of Hollister's chair. The room went quiet in the way that saloons do when something significant is about to happen. Men's hands drifted toward belt guns. Chairs scraped backward. Hollister looked down at the boy with amusement and contempt mixed equally on his face. Samuel delivered his message in that same unflinching voice he'd used in the street, the words coming out flat and factual like he was reciting multiplication tables. My father will be here at noon tomorrow. He asked me to tell you that you can leave before then, or you can stay. Your choice. Hollister's men went tense immediately, but Hollister just laughed and asked what one retired rancher thought he was going to do against 3 professional gunmen. It was a good question, spoken loud enough for the whole room to hear, designed to reassert dominance and mock the absent father. Samuel's answer came without hesitation, and it was devastating in its simplicity. He won't be coming as a rancher. The boy turned and walked out, his too large hat still perched on his head, and the saloon fell into the kind of silence that comes when men realize they might have made a fatal miscalculation. One of Hollister's crew, a younger gun named Pike, asked if they should be worried. Hollister said no, said reputation was just stories men told to feel dangerous, said they'd be at that saloon at noon, and if Jack Cole wanted to die for a wet hat, that was his right to choose. But after Pike left to check the horses and Carver went to get another bottle, Hollister did something that contradicted everything he'd just said. He sent Carver on a late ride to the territorial marshal's office with a request for a deputy to assist with property protection and potential armed resistance to legal operations. It was a hedge against possibilities Hollister wasn't willing to admit aloud. And 15 miles north on a dark road under cold stars, a single rider moved toward town at a steady, unhurried pace. Not racing, not hesitating, just coming with the inevitability of a debt being called due. Jack Cole rode into Salvation Creek 4 hours before the deadline he'd set, arriving with first light when the town still mostly slept and the streets held only shadows and possibility. He didn't ride to the saloon. He rode to the telegraph office first, where the old operator waited with information Jack would need. 3 men, Vance Hollister, Pike, and Carver, all carrying sidearms and 1 rifle among them, working for Cyrus Trent's land operation. Deputy requested and likely arrived on last night's evening stage. Jack absorbed this with the kind of calm that comes from having processed worse situations in worse circumstances. He thanked the operator with a nod and made one request: keep Samuel there until this business was finished. Then he moved through town like a man, conducting reconnaissance rather than seeking vengeance. The livery first, checking horses and exits. The general store to note lines of sight and potential cover. The gunsmith's shop, where his old cavalry colt had been waiting for 6 years. The gunsmith, a man who'd kept that weapon oiled and ready without being asked, simply handed it over with the understanding that passes between men who recognize necessity when it arrives. Jack loaded 6 cartridges with deliberate care, each one settling into the cylinder with a soft click that sounded like a clock ticking down. He slid the Colt into a holster he hadn't worn since his wife's funeral, and the weight on his hip felt like putting on an old skin he'd tried to shed but never quite lost. The townspeople who saw him moving through those morning streets recognized the change, not in his face or his gait, but in the way his eyes measured distances and angles, cataloging cover and kill zones without seeming to look directly at anything. This wasn't the rancher who bought supplies and talked weather. This was the other man, the one they'd heard about but never seen. Then the complication arrived on schedule. Deputy Thomas Warren stepped off the morning stage, young and earnest, and carrying the kind of by-the-book righteousness that gets good men killed in situations they don't understand. Hollister met him with prepared lies and legitimate-looking documents, told Warren that a dangerous squatter named Jack Cole was threatening legal representatives of the Trent Development Company, that Cole had a history of violence, that an arrest was necessary to prevent bloodshed. Warren, who had no reason to doubt official-looking papers and a man requesting law enforcement assistance, believed every word. When the old telegraph operator tried to warn him, tried to explain what was really happening, Warren thanked him for his concern, but explained that he had jurisdiction and a duty to perform. By mid-morning, the positions were set with terrible clarity. Hollister and his men inside the saloon with a territorial deputy now allied with them, believing he was preventing a crime rather than enabling one. Jack Cole standing alone in the street, knowing that shooting a lawman, even in self-defense, even if justified, would make him a wanted fugitive forever and destroy any chance of the quiet life he'd built for Samuel's future. The trap was perfect in its cruel simplicity. Win the fight, but lose everything that mattered, or walk away and teach his son that power always wins and right doesn't matter. But Jack Cole hadn't survived 16 gunfights by accepting impossible situations as final. He walked to the saloon's front entrance, unbuckled his gun belt with deliberate slowness, and hung it on the hitching post where everyone could see. Then he called out to Deputy Warren by name, not threatening, not pleading, just requesting, and asked for 5 minutes of conversation, unarmed, in the open street where everyone could witness. It was a calculated gamble based on one read of character, that Warren was honest, just ignorant, and that an honest man given truth might choose differently than an ignorant one given lies. Deputy Warren stepped out of the saloon into the late morning sun, his hand resting near his gun but not gripping it, his face showing confusion but also willingness. Jack stood 15 feet away in the middle of the street, hands visible and empty, and when he spoke his voice carried the calm of a man who'd already decided that truth was worth the risk of dying for. He told Warren the facts in plain language without embellishment. Cyrus Trent was stealing land through fraudulent claims and purchased officials. Hollister's crew had terrorized 4 towns using violence and legal manipulation. The documents Warren had seen were forgeries bought from corrupt county clerks. The only actual crime committed in Salvation Creek was the assault on a child in broad daylight with witnesses. Warren listened with the kind of attention that separates good lawmen from bad ones, his skepticism visible but not closed. Jack didn't deny his past, acknowledged the 16 killings, acknowledged his reputation, acknowledged that men had reason to fear his name. But he offered something Warren couldn't ignore, proof. Send a telegram to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe. Cross-reference Trent's land claims against the original deed filings. Check the complaint records from the 4 towns Hollister had worked. It would take maybe 30 minutes to verify, and if Jack was lying, Warren could arrest him with a clear conscience. If Jack was telling the truth, Warren would know he'd been used as a weapon by the very criminals he'd taken an oath to stop. The deputy considered this. The request was reasonable, procedural, exactly the kind of proper investigation his training had taught him to conduct. You could see in the way his shoulders relaxed slightly. He was on the edge of agreeing. That's when Vance Hollister made the mistake that would kill him. He stepped onto the saloon porch and told Warren to stop wasting time with talk, to arrest Cole immediately, to do the job Trent was paying good money for the law to do. That last phrase hung in the air like gun smoke. Warren's eyes narrowed. He turned to look at Hollister with the expression of a man who'd just heard something that didn't match the story he'd been sold. He told Hollister to wait inside while he conducted his investigation properly, his voice carrying the edge of authority being reclaimed. Hollister's mask came completely off. He told Warren that if the deputy wouldn't do his job, then he was just another obstacle, and Cyrus Trent didn't pay premium rates to have his operation slowed down by useless lawmen playing by rules that didn't matter out here. It was a full confession delivered in anger and contempt. Warren's hand moved toward his gun in response, but Hollister was faster, had been ready for this possibility, drew and fired in one practiced motion. The bullet took Warren in the gut, and he went down hard. The street exploded into violence. Jack rolled left toward the hitching post where his gun belt hung as Hollister's men burst through the saloon doors with weapons drawn. His hand found the cavalry Colt's grip, and he came up from the roll, already aiming, already squeezing the trigger. First shot caught Pike's center mass as he cleared the doorway. The impact spun him backward into the doorframe, where he slid down, leaving a red smear on the wood. 1 down, 5 rounds left. Carver dove behind a water barrel to Jack's right, and came up with a rifle, firing wild, but forcing Jack to stay behind the minimal cover of the watering trough. Hollister had position on the saloon porch, using the corner post as cover, firing methodical shots that splintered the trough's wooden rim near Jack's head. The tactical mathematics ran in Jack's head even as his heart hammered. 6 rounds total. 1 spent on Pike. 5 remaining. Carver had the rifle and better range. Hollister had position and patience. Jack had accuracy and the knowledge that every shot had to count because there was no reloading in a gunfight. He called out to Carver, voice cutting through the gunfire. Pike's dead. Warren's dying because Hollister shot a lawman. You keep fighting and you're just covering for a man who's already planning his escape. It was psychological warfare, calculated to break the alliance. Jack watched Carver's eyes flick toward Hollister on the porch. Watched the younger gunman realize that Jack was right, that Hollister had already shifted position toward his horse, that loyalty in this business only ran as deep as survival instinct. Carver made his choice. He dropped the rifle and raised his hands high, stepping out from behind the barrel with his palms showing empty. 2 rounds spent. 4 remaining. 1 opponent left. Hollister saw his advantage collapse and made his play. He broke from cover running for his horse tied 20 feet down the hitching rail, firing backward as he ran. Jack stood from behind the trough, planted his feet, and tracked the moving target with the kind of calm precision that 16 gunfights had taught him. First shot took Hollister in the back of his left thigh, shattered the femur, and sent him sprawling forward in the dust. Hollister tried to crawl, tried to drag himself toward the horse, and Jack's final shot. The 4th of 6, leaving 2 in reserve because a professional never empties his gun, hit center mass between the shoulder blades. Hollister died face down in the dirt 10 feet from his horse, reaching for freedom he'd never make. Jack immediately dropped to Warren's side, pressed his shirt into the gut wound to slow the bleeding, and shouted for the town doctor. Blood soaked through the fabric warm and fast, but the doctor arrived within 2 minutes and took over with practiced hands. Warren would live, the doctor said later, though it would be a near thing and a long recovery. The cost lay everywhere visible. Pike dead in the saloon doorway. Hollister dead in the street. Warren gutshot and pale. Bullet holes in wood and water leaking from the trough and broken glass glittering in the dust. Carver sat with his hands on his head under the barrel of Jack's Colt while the telegraph operator ran to get rope for binding. Within the hour, Carver had agreed to testify against Cyrus Trent and the entire land grab operation in exchange for leniency. He gave up names, locations, forged documents, bought officials, everything. The telegraph wires hummed with messages to Santa Fe. Deputy Warren's statement describing the shooting and Hollister's confession. Carver's testimony detailing the Trent operation, requests for federal marshals and investigators. But amid the aftermath and the statements and the bodies being carried to the undertaker, one question burned in Jack Cole's mind as he cleaned blood from his hands. What did winning cost him, and could he ever really be just a rancher again? 3 days after the shooting, Jack Cole stood outside the telegraph office as Samuel emerged still wearing that cavalry hat. Dried and clean, but still too large, still sitting crooked on the boy's head like an inheritance he wasn't quite ready to carry. The territorial marshal had arrived from Santa Fe the day before, reviewed the witness statements and Carver's testimony, cleared Jack of any wrongdoing in the shooting, and issued federal warrants for Cyrus Trent and 6 associates in his criminal organization. Carver's confession had broken the entire land grab operation wide open, leading to indictments that would ripple through 3 territories. The marshal had asked Jack if he'd consider carrying a badge again, called his work clean and necessary, said men like him were rare in a territory that needed law more than it needed legends. Jack declined without hesitation, without explanation, without apology. He told Samuel it was time to go home, that the ranch needed tending and spring fences wouldn't mend themselves. But the boy stood there holding the hat in both hands now, instead of wearing it, turning it slowly like he was examining something he'd never quite seen clearly before. Finally, Samuel asked if they could leave the hat here at the telegraph operator, said it didn't fit him right anymore, said maybe it belonged with the records and the testimony as part of the story that needed remembering. Jack understood what his son was really asking beneath the words. Did any of this solve anything, Or did violence just prove that it follows them no matter where they try to hide? Jack's answer came carefully, honestly, without the comfort of easy certainty. He said that some things in this world can't be walked away from, that protecting family and standing for what's right sometimes means picking up tools you'd hope to leave buried, but that the cost of using those tools is real and permanent and marks a man in ways that don't wash off. He said that's exactly why a man builds the quiet life first, so he has something worth returning to when the violence is finished, so he remembers what he's protecting instead of just what he's fighting. They rode north together toward the ranch as afternoon light stretched their shadows long across the prairie. Father and son, the cavalry hat left behind on the telegraph operator's desk next to the logbook, where this entire story had been recorded in careful handwriting. The old operator watched them disappear into the distance and understood what he'd witnessed. Not the romantic glory of the Old West, but the true price of it. The weight that men like Jack Cole carried so that others could build homes and raise children in something resembling peace. He added one final notation in the margin of his report before filing it. Justice served. Cost: pieces of 3 men's souls. In the years that followed, when travelers passed through Salvation Creek and asked about the town's history, they were told about the day Vance Hollister made the mistake of laughing at the wrong boy, and how the laughter stopped forever when the father came home. The story spread the way such stories do, changing slightly with each telling, but keeping its essential truth, that there are lines that shouldn't be crossed, men who shouldn't be awakened, and prices that get paid in full no matter how long the dead has waited. Some legends are warnings. This one served as both warning and proof. Cross certain lines, awaken certain men, and all the money and guns and legal manipulation in the territory won't save you from the reckoning you started.